that some of the actions by the Ukrainian forces, particularly places like Lugansk, are excessive. We've seen numbers of deaths on the sides of the rebels. You're not worried that some of that is excessive actions?
I think I'd make 3 points here. The first is that in any armed conflict, there are going to be casualties on each side, right? Here, we have not seen any credible reports of things like human rights violations by the Ukrainian government. There are a variety of reports out there. Obviously, it takes some time to run these down on the ground. I don't want to rule it out completely, but we, as of this point, haven't seen credible reports of the kind of human rights violations or things like you mentioned.
Yes, please.
I mean, at a certain point, it was an issue raised, but that Ukraine is at the edge of a civil war. You still looking that way, or just?
Well, we don't look at it that way, because a civil war would imply that there are factions inside a country fighting each other. This is a situation where you have a country with an outside force that's encouraging the fighting in some cases, like in Crimea, annexing it himself. So that's not a civil war. That's another country messing around in its neighbors' internal politics, which is just a different thing.
One of the things that you were pushing with the Ukrainian government, or at least we call it the government of Kiev at that point,
the issue. Call it the Ukrainian government.
Okay. Or Ukrainian government. It was asked. They were asked to make some modifications or whatever, the inclusiveness of the separatists or the pro-Russian entities, whatever. It is still pushed, this issue, or?
Are you talking about the constitutional reform
yes,
process?
Yes, that's the term that you are using it.
Yeah, so obviously they've said they're committed to that. President-elect Poroshenko, who the president met with today, Secretary Kerry did as well. You know, these are things that he's going to, as he moves forward with his government, will be dealing with, but they've said they're committed to it. And we do believe it's an important process.
What's your understanding of what are the main challenges now facing Ukraine? Is the separatist movement, or the economic crisis, or the presence of Russian troops at the borders, or it's not there anymore?
Well, on the Russian troops, we've said they've been slowly moving back from the border. So obviously we believe they need to move quickly. But we have noted, in terms of the troops on the border, that they have been, many of them have moved, many of them have made preparations to move. They are moving slowly, but they're working on that. President-elect Poroshenko himself announced, I think right after his election, that his number one priority after taking office will be to restore order in eastern Ukraine by increasing dialogue with citizens of that region, traveling to the area soon after his inauguration, and increasing the transparency of the ongoing constitutional reform process. So I think there are a couple challenges, right? Ukraine is coming out of a time when it had a leadership that stripped its citizens of, money and rights and ways to choose their own government, and that's why you saw the Ukrainians come out and say that's not okay and we want a new government. So they have some economic challenges, certainly, which is why we've said we think it's important to support them economically. There is a huge security challenge, too, and I think President-elect Poroshenko is focused on that.
Right. How do you differentiate between this not being seen as a civil war in Ukraine, even though, as you just said, there are some Ukraine separatists, some of the separatists at least are Ukrainian, fighting against their government, and a situation like Syria, which I think the State Department, the administration, everybody acknowledges as a civil war, when there are also outside forces.
That's true. The difference, I would say, is in Ukraine there was no violence before outside forces intervened. So in Syria, you had a situation where the government, Syrians
except in like Maidan and places like that.
But that wasn't civil war level violence. No, that was internal. It was things like we've seen elsewhere around the Arab world. For example, it was people rising up against their government. The government cracked down, and eventually the government fled. That's not. We wouldn't term that a civil war. In Syria, when we started calling it a civil war, right, is when you had this local opposition rise up against the government puts them down, and the armed opposition emerges, and there truly is a Syrian on Syrian civil war raging throughout all of Syria, basically. And in Ukraine, there was no military to military level or style violence. I mean, what happened on the Maidan was an uprising and the government putting it down violently.
Okay, but couldn't you also argue
there was no large scale violence like we've seen until the Russians started messing around there.
Okay, but I guess could also argue that so many regions of Ukraine at this point are fighting.
A majority of Ukraine is still completely calm and violence-free. Completely calm and violence-free. That's why you saw with the elections a large, vast majority of the country go ahead to vote totally peacefully and freely. So I actually, in terms of where the fighting's occurring, it really is in a very limited area, which again...
But that could also include Crimea, could
right,
it not?
still very limited. But again, there was no violence. I mean, you can talk about the violence in the score, but that's a different kind of violence than we talk about with the Civil War and that we talk about with what we've seen in Ukraine.